Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault.
And I'm Andrew Chang. Tonight, with cases and criticism up, Manitoba turns COVID code red.
We are truly at a crossroads.
Why the rest of the country should listen up.
It is unacceptable.
A Liberal MP steps aside. CBC News investigates new allegations.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
Never mind concession. A defeated U.S. president presses ahead.
And an iconic interview under scrutiny.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Why the BBC is investigating the interviewer. This is The National.
Well, leaders have tried to avoid shutdowns. COVID-19 restrictions were refined, targeted, repeatedly updated, but the public has struggled to keep up.
And the virus hasn't missed a step. Now Canada is reporting more than 4,000 new cases a day. The signal from Ottawa, we're out of time.
So I urge the premiers and the mayors to please do the right thing. Act now to protect public health.
The situation in central Canada is bad. More than 1,300 new cases reported today in Ontario, 1,100 in Quebec. The West is arguably worst. In absolute terms, these daily numbers are lower, but per capita, Saskatchewan and BC have now overtaken Ontario. Alberta's are higher than Quebec's, and Manitoba has by far the worst rate in the country.
Now, hard shutdowns are coming back across Manitoba, going into effect Thursday. And as Cameron McIntosh tells us, the only surprise for some Manitobans was that it took this long.
Jeremy Regan barely made it through the first lockdown. Now has to shut it all down again.
As we saw the numbers coming up, we just knew something was going to happen.
He's played by the rules, tried to plan for this. But going into his busiest time of year, he's beyond frustrated.
I understand something needs to be done. I think that the ball was dropped months ago.
For weeks, COVID numbers have been soaring in Winnipeg and across Manitoba. 2,000 infections over the last week. ICUs are feeling the strain.
Good morning, everyone.
Forcing the Premier and Chief Medical Officer to follow through on a long-standing warning.
The entire province of Manitoba is moving to critical or red on the pandemic response system.
I'm feeling so sad at the loss of so many Manitobans. I can't begin to describe to you.
Panic is already setting in. Grocery stores will stay open. Unlike spring, so will schools. Non-essential retail, recreational facilities, and places of worship will all close under a strict gathering limit of 0.
This sacrifice over this time will save lives.
With virtually no COVID all summer, Manitoba has gone from envy to cautionary tale, failing to balance the virus and the economy.
Inevitably, what will happen is that the virus will leak through the cracks, any cracks that are there, and transmit.
Polling shows Manitobans favor short-term restrictions to get COVID under control, even if no one is happy about it. Pallister is defending against criticism he let this go too long.
Manitobans have a chance to point fingers and blame people like Dr. Roosin or me, and that is unproductive behavior. Everybody's afraid, everybody's stressed. And the way to deal with this is not to panic, it's to have a plan and follow it, and that's what we're outlining today.
Now, Manitobans are being told to expect this to go at least 4 weeks, possibly even longer, until the infection rate drops and the strain on hospitals lets up. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So as Ontario's government worries about the COVID storm, Toronto is charting its own course. Full red zone restrictions and warnings against gatherings with those outside the immediate household. Vicadopia has the details.
Hopes she could reopen her restaurant doors this weekend.
I really don't know what to do anymore.
Crushed by the city's climbing rate of COVID-19 cases.
This has been really hard to take. I just don't know how much longer all of us can hang on.
For a month, gyms, bars, and dining rooms have been temporarily closed in the city to help slow the surge. That hasn't happened, and now they're not allowed to reopen for at least another 28 days.
And I am truly sorry for this. I really am. However, in my professional opinion, the greatest harm would be to allow COVID-19 to continue to spread at this rate.
Led by Toronto, the average weekly number of cases in Ontario is now double what it was at the height of the pandemic in the spring, about 1,000 a day, with a record 1,388 today.
These numbers are going in the wrong direction.
Despite that wrong direction, the Ford government isn't yet ready to talk lockdowns.
We want to keep the economy going, but we have to do it safely.
The Ontario government recently introduced a color-coded system to simplify closures. It spells out what can reopen and what can't. But the restrictions aren't enough for public health officials in Toronto and Peel region, so they've introduced their own measures. Question is, will it be enough?
No other jurisdiction in the world has been able to show that they're able to let the cases run rampant and both keep businesses open and save lives. So, the writing's sort of on the wall here.
Alita Solomon also sees the writing, a long winter where after nearly 20 years, her business may not survive.
And it breaks my heart because I don't know how to do anything else.
Vic Adopia, CBC News, Toronto.
Okay, now we asked infectious diseases specialist Dr. Lenora Saxinger to join us because Dr. Saxinger, in both Manitoba and Toronto, I'm sensing helplessness and urgency. Where exactly did things go wrong?
Well, I think in a lot of places across the country, we've seen just that too many people are in contact with too many people without enough precautions to prevent transmission. And that sounds very general. I think one other thing we see is that depending on the intensity of transmission, provinces are kind of making attempts to target what they're shutting down, if possible, but there's a lot of unknowns as to how much different areas are contributing to transmission sometimes, especially if we're challenged with the contact tracing. So, for example, restaurants are closed in some places, not in others, and I think that just reflects that unknown.
And yet, help me understand something. I mean, in Manitoba, where the situation is so dire, the code red doesn't even take effect until Thursday. Like, why wouldn't a person take that to mean, hey, I should see my friends one last time before we all get locked down?
You know, that's an interesting point, and I'm not sure about the rationale for the timing, but I definitely have seen implications from elsewhere that when there's a timed onset for a restriction, that there's a little bit of a last-minute rush to do things before a lockdown. I think that's a normal human response, but I'd have to say that in the setting of the types of transmission we're seeing in a lot of places, that could actually be pretty damaging if people take that approach.
Okay, Dr. Saxinger, thank you for making the time as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So Quebec's red zones will stay in effect for at least another 2 weeks.
Our numbers show us that we must be even more careful.
And that means bars and gyms in cities like Montreal and Quebec City will remain closed. Legault said the restrictions are necessary to save lives. The province reported more than 1,100 new cases today. After nearly 8 months of the pandemic, epidemiologists have a pretty good idea about what works. So where has Canada gone wrong? Christine Birak shows us it's not just about shutdowns.
Oh my God.
Disease trackers say Canadians in most provinces are now riding a virtual COVID roller coaster.
As we close down the economy, cases go down. We open the economy, cases rise. We close down the economy, which is not sustainable, and that's where the fatigue comes from.
When the pandemic started, Canada had fewer than 100 cases a day. 8 months later, it's over 4,000. And it's not clear where a third of those people became infected. Some are questioning whether this virus can be controlled without a vaccine. Experts say there's been a steep learning curve, but some provinces are clearly on the wrong track.
It's accepting the roller coaster ride of cases and economic restrictions rather than preventing them in the first place.
But in some places, that's exactly what's happening.
There's parts of this country where COVID's not a thing.
In Canada's north and the Atlantic provinces, around 2.5 million people are living relatively freely, not by ignoring the virus, but by keeping track of it, especially outbreaks.
Find every single case, quarantine every single contact, stop everybody at the border, and absolute control and eradication. And so far, that has been extremely successful.
That same strategy is being used in New Zealand and South Korea. In Europe, the virus was allowed to spread unchecked for too long. Hospitals are hitting capacity. Several countries are locking down for a second time. Some doctors say it's time Canadians tell politicians what track they want to be on.
Okay, I'm prepared to have temporary closures for 2 months. If that means then that's the time that's needed to ramp up test, trace, isolate, and then after that I'd be able to open up.
As no one knows how many times cases will rise and fall before this pandemic is over. Christine Burak, CBC News, Toronto.
And one more note on the pandemic. The federal government has promised $20 million to support veterans organizations that have been struggling.
Our veterans served Canada with honor and valor. They stepped up for us, and now we must step up for them.
Now, most of that money, $14 million, will go to the Royal Canadian Legion. The organization welcomed the funding, but said it still falls short of the $30 million it had requested.
Former employees are leveling new accusations against a Toronto MP just hours after she announced she is leaving the Liberal caucus for breaking the rules by employing her sister. Ashley Burke has the exclusive new details.
I am deeply disappointed.
The Prime Minister didn't defend his now former MP, Yasmin Ratansi. Instead, he said her behavior tarnishes the reputation of every member of Parliament.
It is unacceptable, and I expect there to be a thorough follow-up by the House administration on this.
Late last night, Ratansi posted on Facebook she's leaving the Liberal caucus, saying, "I made an errant judgment by employing my sister in my constituency office, and I have remedied the situation." This after CBC News found her sister had been on her payroll for years, breaking parliamentary rules.
Yasmin told us explicitly, "My sister will be coming on to work in our office. She was going to assume a different name, so she was going to be referred to as Jenny. The idea was we bring her in, but try to conceal her identity, keep her hidden."
That's not all former staff claim. 4 of Ratansi's past employees spoke to CBC News confidentially. Their voices have been changed because they're worried about retaliation and their careers.
There was definitely a lot of explicit as well as casual racism that I observed and heard during my time in that office. A lot of vitriol directed to certain ethnic groups, religious groups.
They claim Ratansi told staff to stop working on some South Asian constituents' immigration files, calling them untrustworthy.
Yasmin maintained a certain skepticism towards certain groups of people, stereotypes really, and used these stereotypes to basically dictate action on certain immigration files.
It was an abusive and toxic environment.
The former staff also claim Ratansi mistreated employees.
She takes out all her frustrations on the staff, whether personal or work-related. She demeans employees, and we were relieved on days that she wasn't at the office.
CBC News asked Ratansi's office for a comment on all of the allegations 2 days ago, but still no word. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
Well, anger is growing over how long it's taking to fix water problems in some First Nations communities. 41 have water advisories in effect right now. One particularly hard hit is demanding answers from their contractor. And as Olivia Stefanovich explains, that's now getting some government support.
Forced from their homes, members of Niskandiga First Nation have had enough, unleashing their frustration at the contractor they hired 4 years ago to fix more than 2 decades of water problems that just got worse.
We want water. We want water.
Most of the community was moved last month, 450 kilometers south, after an oily sheen was discovered in the reservoir and all running water was cut off. The government now says it's a non-toxic mineral oil coming from a pump.
Why did it have to come to this?
Chief Chris Muniz pleads for answers with one of the engineers inside.
I thought you were our help. I thought you were on our side.
As children deliver their own message.
We're not animals, we're not things, we're human, just like you guys. We need your help.
The Indigenous Services Minister is pledging his support. In a letter to the chief, Mark Miller writes his department would like to work with you and other communities to probe the way contractors and engineering companies operate.
So we need to know, are there bad actors?
NDP MP Charlie Angus says the problem stems from contracts being consistently awarded to the lowest bidder.
Costs and corners get cut. And that's the danger. And that's what Neskantaga has been a nightmare situation.
In a statement, one of the contractors says it's committed to bringing a world-class water treatment plant online as safely and as quickly as possible. But the chief still can't understand why it's taking so long.
I don't think it's because where we are situated. I think it's because of the lack of will to finish this.
Neskantaga has the longest-standing boil water advisory of any First Nation in the country, 25 years and still counting. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Ottawa.
An unusual COVID-era virtual trial began today for the man accused of Toronto's van attack back in 2018. 10 people were killed when the van careened down a Toronto sidewalk, striking them. Another 16 were injured. Alec Manassian admits he committed the crime, but he's pleading not guilty. Joanna Remiliotis now with what happened in court today and what some of his victims' loved ones are feeling.
The start was eerily quiet. At Toronto's Convention Centre, public viewing rooms opened early, but few came to watch. A stark contrast to the chaos and horror of that day, when a van hurtled down several blocks, mowing down pedestrians. That Alec Manassian was the man behind the wheel, that he planned and executed the deadly Toronto van attack is not in dispute. The only question before the court, is he criminally responsible? In proceedings held entirely on Zoom, Manassian was expressionless as the Crown pieced together a chilling timeline of that day and presented the full interrogation video.
I was starting to feel radicalized at that time.
Hours after his arrest, Manassian told police he had been rejected and ridiculed by women for years, that he found a welcoming online community among incels or involuntary celibates, and that he planned the van attack a month before as an act of revenge against a society that he says excluded him.
Nice job.
For survivors and their families, it's hard to stomach. Beverly Smith lost both legs in the attack. Her son Michael says the trial is painful but necessary to move on.
I just need to hear it from him why he did this, and if it's the reasons that I've heard, then I just need him to go away and be a little bookmark on the history of my life. And yeah, that's it.
Elwood Delaney's grandmother Dorothy Sewell was killed in the attack. Manassian's defense enrages him.
There's a lot of anger. I feel like he should have died that day, but I'm glad he didn't because it's going to be way worse for him now.
It's not clear what mental health illness will be used in Manassian's defense. Court is expected to hear from expert witnesses from both sides. The trial is scheduled to last for 6 weeks. Joanna Remiliotis, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, a group that represents victims of sexual abuse by priests has said a Vatican report on disgraced former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick isn't enough.
Apologies don't mean anything if they come with a list of excuses while it was okay.
The report details how McCarrick was promoted despite decades of allegations of sexual misconduct. The church is being urged to release its records to civil authorities. Veteran Palestinian negotiator Saib Erakat has died after testing positive for COVID-19. Erakat, who advocated for a two-state solution, was at the forefront of the Palestinian cause for decades. He was 65.
6 weeks of fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan have come to a halt, a truce that seems to be holding over the long-disputed area of Nagorno-Karabakh. But as Chris Brown reports, many Armenians feel angry and abandoned.
For Azerbaijanis, it was a celebration 3 decades in the making. Their military recaptured a huge swath of Karabakh territory. And the country's president went on TV to sneer at the losers.
Pashinyan, ne oldu bəs?
Well, Pashinyan, President Ilham Aliyev said to his Armenian adversary, "Where is your status for Nagorno-Karabakh now? Your status has gone to hell." In the Armenian capital, furious crowds sacked government offices. And the Speaker of the Parliament was beaten up as many blamed their leaders for capitulating.
It's a shame on the world, you know.
Filmmaker Vardan Hovhannisyan chronicled the human catastrophe from the conflict's front lines, including for CBC News. He blames Western countries for staying on the sidelines when a democratic Armenia was under attack from authoritarian regimes.
I don't expect that this big-scale war initiated by Turkey, supported by Syrian ISIS and Islamists, will be done under total silence of the world.
Canada is among those complicit, he says, as it supplied aiming systems for the Turkish-made drones that killed Armenian troops.
You did see, one NATO ally provide support to the enemy of Armenia, and all of NATO, I think, took a hit. The Canadians certainly took a hit.
It now falls to Russia to keep the peace. The first of its peacekeepers flew in today. It will be up to the peacekeepers to ensure those ethnic Armenians who remain in Karabakh are not attacked, and the Azerbaijanis who return are safe as well. Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.
Well, Joe Biden is pushing ahead tonight in the face of statements like this.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
Next on The National, the president-elect sends a message to the White House.
The National Silver Cross mother on preparing for Remembrance Day in a pandemic and keeping her son's legacy alive.
Surreal is the only word.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
And the explosive Princess Diana interview back under the microscope.
It was obtained through deceit and subterfuge.
We're back in 2 minutes.
Welcome back. Joe Biden was declared the next U.S. president 3 days ago. But as Paul Hunter tells us, Donald Trump, his administration, and most of his party still refuse to concede.
President-elect Joe Biden today was having none of it.
I just think it's an embarrassment, quite frankly.
Embarrassing, he said, that Donald Trump continues to deny that he lost last week's election. Outvoted fair and square, but still refusing to concede defeat.
How can I say this tactfully? I think it will not help the president's legacy.
Mr. Vice President, is it time to concede?
Indeed, most senior Republicans are likewise publicly standing by the president, labeled by some as enablers.
Hey everyone. Welcome.
Consider the words today of Trump's Secretary of State.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. Right.
Trump's lawsuits challenging results of last week's elections are now increasingly laughed at by legal experts. Dismissed today by Biden's lawyers as mere noise and theatrics.
We talked about...
For context, recall 4 years ago today, when then-President-elect Trump was invited to the Oval Office by then-President Obama.
And
there was no love lost between the two, but, said Obama,
we now are going to do everything we can to help you succeed, because if you succeed, then the country succeeds.
Mr. President, it was a great honor being with you.
Now cut to 4 years later, and Trump has yet to even contact Biden. The president-elect today suggesting all those Republicans backing Trump are intimidated by Trump. As Trump himself tweeted in all caps, "We will win."
Biden's transition team is moving forward regardless. When asked what's his message to the president, said Biden, he looks forward to speaking with him. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
Now, Alberta has good reason to be very interested in this presidential transition. Carolyn Dunn shows us why some in the energy sector anticipate a big boost from Biden.
When the heart of Canada's energy sector has an office vacancy rate of around 30%, you can bet energy companies are calculating how a Biden presidency will affect them. Dan Balabin, whose company is set to build Canada's largest solar project, is delighted with the election result.
You know, what a Biden victory does is it signals that the world's largest economy is now going to be moving very ambitiously towards greening its economy.
They're not quite popping champagne corks around the Keystone XL pipeline. Biden doesn't like it, as he made clear on CNBC in May.
I've been against Keystone from the beginning. It is tar sands that we don't need, that in fact is in a very, very high pollutant.
It's not clear if Biden will actually pull the presidential permit in place to build and operate Keystone XL. Ottawa and Alberta will be lobbying hard to convince him it's in his best interest not to.
That it is very much a project that's underway, that is employing Americans, that will provide over 800,000 barrels of crude to the American market.
Biden has promised to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, and being closer to Canada on climate goals and federal regulations could bring the certainty some in the fossil fuel industry crave. Biden's promise to ban new fracking on federal land could even be a boon for Canadian natural gas.
If the U.S. slows down on fracking and there's less natural gas production, it could result in higher prices in North America, which could be good for Canadian producers.
But other Biden policies will undoubtedly affect Canada's industry, for better or worse. So the Biden-Harris transition team can expect at least friendly pressure from the North to stay neighborly on resource decisions. Carolyn Dunn, CBC News, Calgary.
Next, the National Silver Cross Mother on the eve of Remembrance Day.
So what will you be thinking on Remembrance Day as you carry that wreath to the
Well, my
cenotaph?
first thought will be of my son.
How she says her son inspired her and continues to inspire a new generation.
Tomorrow, we will mark Remembrance Day. But this year will be different. COVID-19 means many ceremonies are online. Many veterans are staying at home.
Indeed, as with everything else in 2020, organizers of Remembrance Day ceremonies are being forced to adapt, working to avoid large crowds and to adhere to pandemic restrictions. Few will physically attend ceremonies this year, but someone who will is Debbie Sullivan. Now, in 2004, she lost her son, Chris, to a tragic fire aboard HMCS Chicoutimi. Tomorrow, she will lay a wreath at the National War Memorial as this year's National Silver Cross Mother. But before that, she graciously agreed to speak with our Harry Forrestal.
Well, Debbie Sullivan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's nice to meet you.
We're in kind of an unusual location for an interview like this. We're in a school gym, clearly, and which helps with the need to be distant from one another for COVID. But there are other reasons to be here in this school. Can you explain why?
Well, this school is named after my son, Christopher. It's the Chris Saunders Memorial Elementary. It's a pretty special place.
What's it like for you coming here and seeing his name across the front of the building?
It's surreal, is the only word. They live each and every day at the school by the Chris Code. The Chris Code is the name Chris as an acronym, and C stands for caring, H for honesty, R for respect, I for inclusion, and S for safety.
What do you think Chris would think of that?
Well, he'd be floored and he'd be honored, but he'd be shy about it probably. He's like his mother. We're not used to being in the limelight, but he would be pleased because Chris loved kids, and especially the little ones. He always gravitated towards the shy and the quiet ones and befriended them and helped them get by, yeah.
Where do you think that came from?
I'm hoping from me, because it's something that I taught him about being kind and compassionate and understanding and always helping out those less fortunate than himself. So I'm hoping I had something to do with it, but he had a pretty determined mind. When he set his mind to something, he usually carried it through.
Well, when he set his mind to the military, how surprised were you by that?
I wasn't surprised when he told me that he was going to join the reserves, because he is also a daredevil, and he liked an adventure. And he's actually the one that inspired me to join the military, and I did. So.
You joined after Chris.
After Chris, that's right.
Why?
Because I also wanted an adventure. I wanted to try something different. Yeah.
Tell me what you said to him, or what you thought when he came to you to say, Mom, I'm going to join the military.
I said, good for you, son.
Yeah.
I said, but you do know you're going to have to take orders. Because he didn't take them from his mom very well sometimes. But he said, yeah, I know.
So that's what you said. What did he say when you told him you were going to join? Oh, no. Don't embarrass me.
Don't embarrass me. Yeah, that's what he said. Don't embarrass me.
Here is Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. An emergency in the North Atlantic has turned into a tragedy. A Canadian sailor has died after a fire on board one of the country's newly acquired submarines. Today, it cost Lieutenant Chris Saunders his life.
From what I've been told, he immediately took charge and gave whatever orders needed to be given and was rushing back to his station when he collapsed. So that's where he was heading. In the dark, he couldn't find the port to put his breathing apparatus into, and the smoke and gases overtook him and he passed out. So, and that's where they found him.
When you heard that there had been the accident on the Scrutiny, you did see subsequent news coverage.
I did. I wish I hadn't watched, but I was drawn to it. I had to see it.
A battered boat in a brutal sea. This was HMCS Scrutiny today.
The damage caused by the fire was more extensive than first thought.
And what did you see? What?
The biggest controversy that was going on immediately following was why Christopher wasn't evacuated off the submarine right away. And all I could see was the news footage of that submarine in the high seas just going back and forth in the water. And all I could think of was how could they possibly evacuate anyone off in those conditions. So they did get him evacuated off along with some of his crewmates that were injured as quickly as they possibly could. But I also know, because of the coroner's report, that it wouldn't have mattered if Christopher had been evacuated off within minutes. It wouldn't have mattered. The damage was already done, and he would not have survived no matter. I wasn't angry. I went to the inquiry. I was there. I got the details, and I'm satisfied with their findings. It was just a very tragic accident.
You have 2 grandchildren, Chris's sons.
Mm-hmm.
Do you talk to them about their father and
on occasion. The boys know all about their dad. Luke didn't get to meet it. Well, he met his dad, of course, but he was a newborn infant, so I'm sure he doesn't remember him. But I'm pretty sure Ben does remember him. So, and believe me, they know who their daddy is. Yeah. At first, the first few years, it was hard to look at Ben because he looked so much like Chris. Yeah, handsome dude. Both the boys are handsome boys. Yeah.
So what will you be thinking on Remembrance Day as you carry that wreath to the
Well, my
cenotaph?
first thought will be of my son, and I will also be thinking of all the other families who had lost their loved ones. I'll be thinking of all the veterans, and because of COVID, I'm really not sure exactly how things are going to work. I know that it will be different, and I may not get to meet some of the veterans who are still alive, but I hope I do, because I just want to thank them. Yeah, thank them all for their service.
Well, you've been very courageous and very kind in speaking to us and in sharing Chris's life with us today. I want to thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
As Debbie Sullivan suggested, this will be a very different Remembrance Day, with parades canceled, ceremonies limited, and for the first time, no crowds. Of course, It's all in an effort to slow the spread of COVID-19. But as Murray Brewster shows us, this approach might also accelerate an existing trend towards virtual remembrance.
It will be a Remembrance Day like none we've ever seen. Lockdowns, socially distanced commemorations. In some ways, it could not have come at a worse time. When we think of Remembrance Day, this is what comes to mind. The great wars of the 20th century and the veterans who fought them, many of whom are now gone. Keeping the memories alive was going to be a challenge with or without COVID. Some institutions, like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which maintains 23,000 cemeteries around the world, have begun reimagining remembrance digitally.
I think what this virtual commemoration or virtual remembrance, I think, it's a way to maintain contact. It's a way to maintain presence in our lives of these soldiers and airmen and sailors who are buried a long way away from Canada.
Like Flying Officer Ramsay Habkirk, a Canadian among a Commonwealth crew dropping supplies to spies in occupied France, shot down and killed in the summer of 1944. He is the only Canadian buried at the cemetery in Tilly-sur-Seure.
What struck me is that he was here by himself in a cemetery that isn't very well visited at all.
He decided to honor Flying Officer Ramsay Habkirk by posting a tribute on the War Graves Commission's virtual wall of remembrance, where people are invited to post the stories of individual soldiers, sailors, and aircrew. There is, however, more to the virtual wall.
I think this pandemic, if it's done one thing, it's shown us that perhaps now is the time to start to have those debates about, well, do we need to do something different to engage that generation? So we also need to start asking that generation about, well, how would you remember? And perhaps be creative, be virtual. You creating a little video, or perhaps your class reading out a poem, that's absolutely as valid as Her Majesty the Queen laying her wreath at the Cenotaph in London on the 11th of November every year.
Virtual walls may be just the beginning. One day soon, you may be able to take your phone, point it at a grave, and see the story behind the tombstone.
A Calgary company, Faces of Valor, is using archive data to create the digital experience.
If our software can help people connect in that way, empathetically, to just one story, that's amazing. And this is why I get so excited about this stuff, is it's powerful.
Going digital may give future generations more information and context. There will still be a need, however, for us to stand together among the crosses, row on row, to fully appreciate the tragedy that is war. Murray Brewster, CBC News, Ottawa.
Rosemary Barton will host our special coverage of Remembrance Day starting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. You can watch it on CBC TV or stream it live on GEM. You can also listen to our radio special hosted by Matt Galloway and Neil Cooksall on CBC Radio 1.
Still ahead, why the BBC is promising a new investigation into an iconic Princess Diana interview.
First, what we know about COVID-19 in schools and why students in one province are being hit harder.
Welcome back. The pandemic has certainly changed schooling in Canada. Mandatory masks, online learning, lessons in how to stop transmission between students. But different provinces are getting very different results. Deanna Sumanek-Johnson shows us.
2 weeks into the school year, Kathy Maloney moved her kids from online learning back to class. But it wasn't an easy decision. The school has emailed twice to say they had a positive case.
The school never got shut down, no classes were canceled, anything like that, because the kids weren't actually directly affected. And so what the school is doing is they're very, very open.
2 months into the school year, COVID-19 cases in schools are rising. But the catastrophe scenario many predicted in August, with mass school shutdowns and outbreaks spilling into the community, did not happen in most of the country.
We're not seeing widespread transmission of the virus in schools, despite many cases that are community acquired.
And in Ontario, over the last 14 days, schools contributed 936 of the province's more than 15,000 new cases, a little over 6%. But in Quebec, that number is significantly bigger, says this researcher.
It's really the school-age kids, primarily the 10 to 19 age groups, that are accounting for the highest number of cases now in Quebec.
One possible reason for that, Quebec only mandated masks in schools in early October.
I think we've been playing catch up ever since.
She also blames poor ventilation, an increasingly important factor as the cold weather forces students to spend more time indoors. It's just one of the reasons experts recommend vigilance. Schools may not be driving community transmission, but they sure do reflect it.
We're seeing the consequences of increasing community rates, where we're seeing more kids coming in with unrecognized COVID-19.
It's something Kathy Maloney is keeping an eye on. She hopes her own watchfulness and that of other parents in her community can give the kids some semi-normalcy as the pandemic continues. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
Next, the Princess Diana interview under scrutiny.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
New allegations and a new investigation into how that interview all came about.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's Daily News podcast Front Burner, everything you want to know about the new COVID-19 vaccine that's supposedly 90% effective. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
When Princess Diana poured her heart out on television in 1995, the interview itself had a bit of a murky backstory. Now, that journalist's scoop of a lifetime is under new scrutiny, with allegations of lying, cheating, even forgery. Renee Filipponi explains.
It was an exclusive sit-down that exposed Princess Diana's struggles and intimate details of her life.
Do you think Mrs. Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
The interview with BBC's Martin Bashir came together at a time of turmoil for Diana, where, according to those close to her, she was paranoid and believed the palace was out to get her. Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, introduced her to the journalist after Bashir showed him bank statements that appeared to show people were being paid to spy on the princess. Now the graphic designer who made those statements is hoping to clear his name.
Martin asked me to make up a couple of bank statements that he needed the following day. And he did say that they were just going to be used as copies. So on that night, I was just making some props for filming purposes.
Not long after the 1995 interview, there was an internal investigation, and Bashir was cleared of wrongdoing. But in recent weeks, Diana's brother has alleged the BBC knew more and accuses the broadcaster of a cover-up. The princess's longtime friend says answers and apologies are needed.
I think the most important thing is that the truth is told. And a lot of people are saying she would have done an interview anyway. The fact is, this is the only one that she did. The fact is that it was obtained through deceit and subterfuge.
Sunday church attendance.
The BBC says Bashir is unwell and unavailable for comment. The current religious affairs reporter is recovering from heart surgery and COVID, but was seen out this weekend.
The BBC's Director General says it's taking this very seriously and are in the process of commissioning a robust and independent investigation. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, London.
Well, next on The National, we revisit Manitoba with some good news. This woman survived COVID, and she is celebrating. Next in our moment.
Well, this is a resident in a long-term care home in Manitoba, clearly celebrating. Why? Well, because she survived COVID-19, and to commemorate, she asked for a dance to a song fit for the occasion, none other than Staying Alive. And that celebration is our moment.
We had a resident that looked like she was going to fully recover from the COVID virus, and we wanted to plan a parade. We asked her which song she wanted to have played, and she said Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. She also said that she wanted a t-shirt that said COVID Survivor. There was such a sense of excitement and joy and hope for everyone that was there. And I think it came at a time when my staff, my other residents, our family members really needed to see something good coming from a long-term care.
That's really sweet. And so what a parade, right? A short parade, though. I mean, just from her isolation room to her own room there, but clearly a labor of love there.
And Lori, who runs that long-term care home, said that, just to give you a sense of how good people are, when it came time to staff the COVID ward, it wasn't hard finding people because staff members just volunteered and said, I'll do it, I'll do it. You know, people are great. That is the National for November 10th. Good night.
Good night.